We are about to embark upon a series of strange and exciting, dangerous adventures. Adventures that will lead us to all parts of the world.
Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. This time we're looking at American Mythology Monsters, Issue 1. This is a three-part mini-series from American Mythology Productions, featuring 3 short stories, all of which are part 1 of 3. We have The Bite, written by Glenn Moan, art by Demi Mandir, letters by Natalie Jane. Then we have Parts, written by Constantine Paradis, art by Ev Quintada, letters by Natalie Jane. And Saphia, written by Michael Gordon, art by Dan Parsons, letters by Natalie Jane. I have the main cover by Royale Martinez and Arthur Hesley. That is a really cool cover. It actually got me to buy it because Mummy vs. Werewolf would be an interesting story. This was edited by Mike Wolfer, who does quite a bit of work over at American Mythology. Now, the first story starts off at the University of Maryland. There was some sort of crime that leads to a flashback to this university setting, and we learn that this professor has his wife leave him. She found out about an affair, and apparently he's had quite a few. A student even assaults him, so he goes on vacation realizing that he's probably going to lose his job and his life is spiraling apart. So what else do? You go to the Bahamas to get away from it all and apparently waste lots of money. Well, he gets pretty wasted and things go south really quick. We're left with a cliffhanger ending. There's some nudity in this story, but it was a fairly interesting story. This guy's kind of a scumbag though, so fairly unlikable. The next story, Parts, it's kind of a Dr. Frankenstein story where there's this biomechanoid thing that this doctor created. It's a guy that really wanted to add features onto himself. He wanted more mechanical parts and they keep giving him more. He ends up in this like insectoid type armor. It's really messed up and we end up with a pretty interesting cliffhanger there. That story was okay. Then Saphia takes place somewhere in Egypt around Cairo. The story's a little messy, but they do a scan of a mummy and the professor guy or doctor has clearly got a thing for his assistant whose name is Saphia, and there's something funny going on with that mummy. This story was actually pretty good. It was a little confusing, but I think that's because it's broken into 3 parts. So the first story is the best one, the third one is the second best, and the second story is the kind of least of my favorites. Overall though, for black and white, they're pretty well done. The second story is more digital art, and I think the art style was a little simplistic at times, but it's not bad. The first story is definitely more inking and heavy line work that would fit more black and white style, and the third one's kind of the same way. Thought the mummy looked really cool, and the other monster that's kind of alluded to at the beginning of that third story was pretty good, but the first story had the best art, I would say, the best traditional horror anthology style art like you would find in Creepy or Famous Monsters or something along those lines. But if you're into those old style horror comics like Vault of Horror, things like that, especially the black and white stuff from the magazine sizes, this will definitely appeal to you. It's got kind of that same feel, and you get part of 3 stories. I would actually try and get this in trade if you're interested, but it definitely seems like it's going to be better to read it as complete stories. But I thought it was pretty good. Worth a read. It's not my typical type of comic because I'm not real big on these anthology types where they're broken up into multi-part stories. I'd rather have one complete story in an issue, but it's not bad for what it is. If you like these style of comics, you'll definitely like this one, I think. That'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links to my Patreon, Streamlabs, and Teespring store are all in the description. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. This time we're looking at American Mythology Monsters Issue 2. This is a 3-part mini-series from American Mythology from 2021, and this is part 2 of 3 different stories, because this is an anthology. Part 2 of The Bite, written by Glenn Moan, art by Demi Mandir, letters by Natalie Jane. Parts, part 2 by Constantine Paradis, art by Ev Quintada, letters by Natalie Jane. And Saphia, written by Michael Gordon, art by Dan Parsons, letters by Natalie Jane. Main cover by Mike Wolfer and Arthur Hesley. Cover's okay. It really kind of relates here, but not entirely. So the Bite is picking up with the victim wandering around. He's lost his job after being discovered naked, and it's a little slow going. His credit cards don't work. He's broke, but then he has an episode at a convenience store, and it gets crazy. It's got some really good monster art, but the other looks a little bit sketchy. So I thought the monster looked really cool, but it's a little too undefined on some of the features and just a little abstract at times, but it's got potential. I just think the artist needs to work on features a little more. The second story has a similar problem, except this one is parts, and it's about the guy wanting body parts replaced with like cybernetics, and he gets weapons upgrades. He looks very, very crazy. One of the scientists tries to fight back, and it causes problems for the third scientist, and they try and use a dead body slash cyborg thing to stop him. It's leading into the final installment. This art is also a little bit sketchy, does need a little bit of refinement, but the monster looked really good as well, and the backgrounds looked really, really good too. So I think the facial features just need a little bit more definition, but this one art wise is better. I just didn't enjoy the story as much. The third one, Sophia, is about the mummies, and the mummy grabs one of the female scientists and sends her on a little history tour, and it was okay. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it wasn't bad. The art's pretty solid for the style it's in. They all have that sort of feeling of the old Warren comic magazines. I think these would have been better as single issue stories. It would have given them time to breathe and elaborate on things, and it would have provided a more cohesive story. Because if you pull this out of a bin somewhere, it's going to make almost no sense. There's 3 partial stories here. There's no complete stories. I get what they were going for. I just don't like that kind of format. It didn't really work that well for me in Marvel Comics Presents back in the day, but I understand what they're doing. I just think 3 one-shots or have an ongoing series with single issue stories would have been a better approach for this, because then you would have got more people impulse shopping and picking it up because they know it's a complete story. But I will recommend it. You could probably find it in the discount bin somewhere, but I didn't have a problem with it overall. I thought it was entertaining. Not typically my type of comic, but I'll recommend it if you can find it for a reasonable price. I didn't feel cheated for the cover, but I think some of the art needs a little work. But beyond that, not really bad stories, just not entirely my genre. But if you like horror comics, this will probably be for you. That'll do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one. Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. This time we're looking at American Mythology Monsters Issue 3. This is the final installment of a 3-part mini-series from American Mythology from 2021. First story is called The Bite, written by Glenn Moan, art by Demi Mander, letters by Natalie Jane. Parts, the second story written by Constantine Paradiaz, art by Ev Cantata, letters by Natalie Jane. And Sophia is the third story written by Michael Gordon, art by Dan Parsons, letters by Natalie Jane. Main cover, which is what I have, is by Mike Wolfer and Peria Pilia. I like the cover, it's really good, but it really doesn't do the book any favors, because this doesn't really happen in the book. It's a cool cover, though. So this is a new take on the Frankenstein monster, the mummy, and the werewolf. And the first story, The Bite, is the final installment for the werewolf story. The werewolf went crazy in a bar and ended up killing a whole bunch of people, only to be captured. It looks like the future's uncertain for Mr. Whitney, as he is going to be subjected to what appears to be a future of brutality. Second story, Parts, finds the monster upgrading by absorbing another thing, and their kill switches that were implanted in the systems are not working, and the scientists have to resort to desperation, but not everything is as it seems, and although it looks like a victory, it really isn't. The third story, Sophia, is the mummy story, and Sophia is turning into a mummy of sorts with fangs for some reason, and she goes on a bit of a spree. It looks like Kareem may survive, but a lot of other people don't. And there is a bit of a cliffhanger ending here as well. I think it was a bit cheap to have cliffhanger endings. I'm not a giant fan of these anthology books where they're sectioned out. Marvel Comics Presents did it back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it kind of worked there, but it was still really annoying to only get part of a story. I'd rather they did a complete story per issue, and it would have been more exciting that way, because with only part of a story, you really get kind of lost, and you forget what happened, especially because it's only like 8 pages, so you tend to lose track of what was going on, and it's incredibly condensed this way, and I did care for it. The art is very hit and miss. The second story I thought had the weakest art. It's really, really light line work, but at least the people look good. The monster looked a little bit silly. The first story had pretty sketchy art. It's very, very heavy on pencils. The werewolf looked okay, but it looked very rushed and ill-defined, and often from a distance looks a bit messy, so I'm not a big fan of that art style. The third story had the best art, but I think the story really really needed to have more room to expand on. It felt very rushed, especially in this installment. Overall, it was okay. Now, if you're gonna read these, I would recommend waiting till you get all 3 issues and then read them, but this is definitely, unfortunately, dollar bin material. It's not bad. I don't feel cheated for what I paid for this issue, and it took me a while to track this one down, but it's definitely not going to be for everyone, and horror fans are really not the target audience. This is more for normies looking for something to read around Halloween time, and I don't know if this has been collected in trade. They should probably do that and have all the stories together so that it's not sectioned out in 3 sections per issue, and just have them as complete stories. The cover's the best art, and the final story is definitely a much more in the vein of the Warren magazines and that sort of art style from like the older EC era. So I think this is probably not going to be great for diehard horror comic fans, but if you like the old EC stuff, you might get something out of it. But I would say grab it out of a dollar bin or find it in a collected work if they've done one. Beyond that, it was a decent read. I just don't think it's worth the cover price, unfortunately. I know they've done a sequel to this, and I will be looking at that shortly. Unfortunately, my take on it is this is not the worst thing I've ever read, but it's definitely a little weak for what I've seen from American Mythology. But I think that's only because they sectioned it out into 3 issues instead of having a complete story in each issue. I think it would have been much better to sit down and read these as one work, because it looks like there was a gap in between production of the stories, and these installments looked a lot weaker than the previous ones. So that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links are in the description to various support methods. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one.